the temple and Jerusalem. And that becomes part of the mix of the prophecy, part that is problematic with respect to its fulfillment. Here, that text, which should be one of the greatest proofs of the credibility of Jesus and of the Bible, has become the very text that the critics hone in on to refute the Scriptures and the claims of Christ. We see at the beginning the prediction about the destruction of the temple. Verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled? And you get the question. Jesus sits down with his disciples. He's just made this incredible prediction. And they're asking him two questions. Tell us when. Not where, not how, not what, not who. When. That is a question with respect to time. The disciples want to know when this is all going to happen. It's as simple as can be. It's plain interrogative here. And the second question is, what will be the sign? What will point us to the moment? What will lead us or guide us to an awareness of the imminence of these things? When will all of these things take place? What will be the sign? Well, those are the questions. And Jesus answering them began to say, take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will deceive many. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and troubles. These are the beginnings, just spells out, have to do with the answer to the question of what will the sign of the fulfillment of all these things be. And in popular nomenclature that take place, wars and rumors of wars, nations rising against nations, famines, earthquakes, and all of that sort of thing, are popularly called in Christian nomenclature what? The signs of the times. Just recently, I read an article where somebody was giving a study of the increased frequency of measurable earthquakes in the 20th century over earlier centuries, the number of famines that have been reported around the world, the amount of violence that's been recorded in the 20th century with the wars and rumors of wars that we've had, all in the service of coming to the conclusion that Christ is coming any day now, because we're seeing the signs of the times rapidly being fulfilled. So again, the majority of futuristically oriented interpreters of the Olivet Discourse see all of these things that Jesus is saying here as signs that will not take place until literally thousands of years after the time that the prophecy was first made. These are the beginnings of sorrows, but watch out for yourselves. Now notice in verse 9, Jesus says to his disciples, watch out for yourselves. They will deliver you up to councils. You will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or meditate what you will speak, but whatever is given to you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Now brother will betray brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. Now, one of the problems we have when we read these prophecies is that we make the assumption that the primary people to whom these prophecies are addressed.
I just don't know how much work is left, so I'll look at the pictures.
We read these prophecies as if they were written last week, and that Jesus wasn't talking to his contemporaries, wasn't talking to his disciples, but he was talking to us, or at least by extension to us. Now, that's a sound principle insofar as we believe that the application throughout the New Testament of Jesus' words to his disciples comes down through the centuries to every generation of Christians. But again, let us not forget that here Jesus is answering a question to specific people at a specific time in history when they said to him, when will these things take place? And he says, certain things have to take place first. And then he says to them, but you will be brought before kings and rulers and suffer persecutions. Now let me just pause for a second and ask the question. Did that part of the prediction take place, according to the book of Acts, to the contemporaries of Jesus who heard that one? Yes. I mean, they were indeed persecuted at that time. So watch for yourselves, for they will deliver to you the counsels, you will be beaten, you will be brought, you, when they arrest you, and so on. Then verse 14, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand, and this is a very mysterious part of the text, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down into the house, nor to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter, for in those days there will be tribulation, such has not been seen since the beginning of the creation which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless the Lord had shortened these days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the day. Now, here we hear about the abomination of desolation, and we hear about the great tribulation. Popularized in the best-selling book, The Late Great Planet Earth. And all of the arguments and discussions that go on among Christians today about whether Jesus is going to come before the tribulation, during the tribulation, or after the tribulation. But along with this forecast of a tribulation, and it's all part of answering the question, when will these things be? Jesus gives specific directions on how to avoid the tribulation. When you see these things take place, flee. If you're in Judea, head for the hills. Now, what we're going to be looking at in the course of this study is the fierce suffering and tribulation that came upon the Jewish nation in terms of the conquest of Palestine by the Roman armies and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which was the first great Holocaust of history, where 1.1 million Jews were slaughtered in the city of Jerusalem in AD 7. And one of the things that we know from history that's remarkable is that when Palestine was invaded and the Romans were taking town by town, village by village, before they even began the siege of Jerusalem, and the armies crossed the border, one of the reasons why there were so many people killed in Jerusalem was that people went to Jerusalem seeking safety behind the massive walls of the great city. Because that was the normal process in antiquity. that when an advancing army came, people fled for the walled cities for safety. Jesus says to his disciples, when you see these things happen, don't go to the sea, but go to the hills, which is exactly what the early Christian community did in 70 A.D. Where the Jews fled to the city, followers of Jesus took heed of these warnings and fled elsewhere. Now, let's continue. And if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, he is there, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed. I have told you all these things beforehand. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars of heaven will fall, the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then will he gather his angel and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest parts of heaven. Now we see the crux of the problem, where now Jesus answering these questions. When will these things be? What will be the sign of his coming? Now he talks about signs in the heavens, not just signs on the earth. Astronomical perturbations. The sun doesn't give its light, the moon, and so on. And we talk about all of these things as harbingers of the final sign of the coming of Jesus in clouds of glory. Here, Jesus clearly includes his coming in glory as part of the content of this prophecy. And it's that part that later on in the text is included when he says, assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all of these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. So, included in this future prophecy is not just the destruction of the temple, and not just the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, but also Jesus' clear prediction of his coming at the end of the age on clouds of glory. And all of these things, he says, are going to take place before that generation passes away. Now, what do we do with this? Well, there's several options. The first option is the option that the critics give, namely that Jesus was simply mistaken, that he meant by this generation that lived no more than 40 years. And it didn't happen. He was wrong. Second view of this is to spiritualize the term generation, to mean something other than a time frame reference of 40 years, and it can be indefinite, looking for a literal fulfillment of all of the content. Third option is to take a second glance at what Jesus was specifically talking about in the Olivet Discourse in terms of his coming. Was he speaking about his final coming at the end of time? Or was he speaking of his coming at the end of the Jewish age, which is not the end of history, because the Bible makes a distinction between the age of the Jews and the age of the Gentiles. Now, more modern scholarship has paid much more attention to this concept of the end of the age than has been done in the past. And we're going to explore the possibility that what Jesus is talking about here in the Olivet Discourse is not his final appearance at the end of history, but his coming in judgment upon the Jewish nation in 70 A.D. But we'll take that up in our next session. In our last session of our study of the last days, you will recall that I went through Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse, and we saw all of the elements that were contained in that future prophecy that Jesus gave to his disciples about the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then all of the signs of the times that he enumerated, and then concluding with his prediction of his coming in clouds of glory, after which he indicated that that generation would not pass away until all of these things would be fulfilled. And we've looked at some of the critical problems that we face with respect to the time frame that Jesus attaches to all of these things that are included in the Olivet Discourse. And we recall that the time frame that Jesus gave was in direct response to the question raised by his disciples to him when they said, "When will these things take place?" Now, in trying to deal with all of the material that is found in the Olivet Discourse, the first thing we have to wrestle with is our principle of biblical interpretation that we apply to the text. And one of the most important principles of biblical interpretation is that called the sensus literalis. That is often interpreted or translated by the words the literal sense of Scripture. Now that's somewhat misleading, because in the way in which people popularly use the term literal translation, they mean by that things take place, they come to pass in exact measure according to what was written in the Scripture. Whereas the concept of literal interpretation, as it was first set forth in the Reformation, meant that the Bible is always to be interpreted according to the sense in which it is written. Namely, that there are some forms of literary structure in the Bible that are written in a sense of historical narrative. Other times we encounter the form of poetry. Some language we find is ordinary historical language. Other language is figurative or metaphorical. Now, to keep that in mind, I want to look at the elements in the Olivet Discourse, and we'll use, again, Mark's version as a guide today. And I'm going to make a distinction between ordinary and figurative language. Now, what I mean by ordinary language is what some folks mean by literal interpretation. That is, that the text means exactly what it seems to suggest that it's saying in the ordinary use of words. Figurative language is when there's a symbolic element in the speech pattern or the literary form that is being used. Now, if we look at Mark 13 and the Olivet Discourse, we basically have three options in front of us on how to interpret the Olivet Discourse. The first option is to assume, this would be option number one, that the whole discourse is to be understood according to interpretation using ordinary language, or what is normally called literal language. That's one option. A second option is the whole thing is figurative or metaphorical. And the third would be that it uses partly literal language or partly ordinary language. So some part is ordinary, and the other part would be figurative. Those are basically the options that we have as we come to that text and seek to interpret it. Now, those critics that we have examined so far who have used the Olivet Discourse as a lever to attack biblical trustworthiness and even the accuracy of the prophecy of Jesus himself, have applied ordinary literal language to the whole of the Olivet Discourse. And they see that certain parts of the discourse did take place according to the predictions, namely, when Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, in simple, ordinary language, that's exactly what happened in recorded history. And likewise, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem happened according to the ordinary language that Jesus uses in the Olivet Discourse. But if we apply ordinary language to the third critical aspect or dimension of the content of the prophecy, namely Jesus' return in glory at the end of the age, the critics say that has not taken place literally. And they also give a literal interpretation to the statement, this generation will not pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. So you see then that if you take all of the elements of the Olivet Discourse and apply a literal translation to them, you have serious problems, as the critics have raised. Now, I don't know anyone who would argue that all of the Olivet Discourse is given in figurative, metaphorical language, for the simple fact that the temple in 70 AD and that Jerusalem wasn't simply figuratively devastated in 70 AD, but both of these events transpired in literal fashion. So that leaves us really with the third option, which is looking at this text and seeing an interspersion here of ordinary language added to it with certain elements of figurative, metaphorical language. And that's the approach I'm going to take to the text. Now the question then becomes, what part of the text do we deal with in terms of literal interpretation? And what part of the text do we deal with in terms of figurative interpretation? And that's when the whole issue becomes complicated and somewhat difficult. Obviously, if we list the key elements of the discourse, the destruction of Jerusalem, of the temple, I think we would all agree that that language here is used in an ordinary, literal sense. And so we'll say literal or ordinary for the destruction of the temple. The second element is the element of the destruction of the entire city of Jerusalem. And we say that took place literally in 70 AD, and so we will assign literal interpretation to that element. Well, what about the coming of Christ in glory? We're going to just put a question mark there right now. Did Jesus literally come back within this framework, or did he not? And we'll leave that question hanging for a second. And then we have the signs that are enumerated in there, that the disciples would be delivered up to councils, that they would be persecuted, that there would be false Christs arising, that there would be wars, rumors of war, famines, earthquakes, the appearance of the abomination of desolation, and the gospel would go to all nations. And I'm going to separate that one out, but we'll say that the signs, for the most part, are understood to be taking place literally. We're talking about real earthquakes, real persecutions, real tribulation, real false messiahs, and so on. And so that, for the most part, is agreed upon by biblical scholars that is to be interpreted in ordinary language or literal language. Now, the question of the gospel to all nations is a question. And the sense and meaning of the term end of the age is a question. And of course, one of the big questions regard the astronomical perturbations, I'm going to call those, the upheaval of the heavens that is described as a precursor of the coming of Christ. We're going to raise a question about that, and then in the final analysis, the question of this generation will not pass away. Are we to interpret that literally or figuratively? So I'm not going to spend time dealing with those portions of the Olivet Discourse about which there's little or no debate in terms of their literalness. The temple, Jerusalem, the signs other than the ones I have extrapolated. All right. Let's begin, since the big question has to do with the coming of Christ at the end. Let's leave that one alone for a minute, and let's look at some of these other ones that have questions attached to it. First of all, what does the Olivet Discourse mean when it speaks about the gospel being proclaimed to all nations before the fulfillment of the sum and substance of the Olivet Discourse? In modern Christian expectation, there are many who believe that until the gospel is literally preached to every tongue and every tribe and every people on this earth, until the gospel penetrates every nation on the globe, Christ will not return. In fact, some of the world mission enterprises are fueled by the desire to fulfill this sign to hasten the day of Christ's coming. Now, my question is twofold with respect to this particular sign. The first place, what is referred to by the nations? I don't know what the Olivet Discourse is referring to with its reference to all nations. But I can tell you this, which is an important aspect of our understanding of this text, that the phrase or the word here, nations, is used in two distinctly different ways in the New Testament. On the one hand, the word ethnoi, or nations, is used on occasion to refer to Gentile nations. But also, Israel, being composed of tribes, was also referred to from time to time in the New Testament of the nations of Israel. So that this text could simply mean that the gospel would go to all of the tribes or nations of Israel before the fulfillment. Now remember, the link to the other passage that is in dispute when Jesus said, "You will not go over all of the cities of Israel until you see the kingdom of God coming in power," and so on. But now, even though I grant that as a possibility, I don't think that that's what's in view here. I do think that this is a reference to different nationalities, not just Jewish tribes or Jewish nations. So if we mean by that this literally has to be fulfilled, then obviously the critics have a strong position here to say Jesus said that this was all going to take place within a single generation, and obviously the gospel has not gone to all nations in that time frame. However, if you go to Paul's letter to the Romans, Paul in Romans talks about the gospel having been spread abroad throughout the whole world already by the time he's writing to the Romans, and he's speaking of the known world of that day, that the book of Acts and the mandate to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the Jewish or to the Gentile nations was already fulfilled in dramatic manner by the time Paul was writing Romans, and he talks about the gospel having gone out to the whole world. Now that phrase is an idiomatic expression of the people to refer to the Roman world of the day, and in that case we would not interpret it literally to mean each and every single nation or tribe or tongue. So that's why we have a question mark next to that phrase of the gospel to all nations. Now, the next one is also key to the whole dispute, and that is what is meant by the end of the age. And that question is so important that I'm going to spend time dealing and addressing that separately in a different lecture. Let me just say in passing that those who believe that the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse in its entirety took place within 40 years after the prediction of Christ, namely within the time frame of that generation of contemporaries who heard Jesus' prophecy, believe that what Jesus is speaking about here is not the end of world history, but the end of the Jewish age, the end of the economy of redemption that focused upon the Jewish nation, which did come to an end coincidental with the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. In 70 AD, we see a decisive moment of separation of the Christian community from the Jewish community, and Christianity as a world religion emerging from that crisis moment. It had been gradually moving towards that final severance that took place in 70 AD, and we will look, as I said, in greater detail at that later on. But just in passing, again, if the end of the age means the end of the world in a literal sense, then obviously that didn't take place within the time frame of one human generation, and still hasn't taken place. All right, what about the astronomical perturbations that we find where it talks in the text about the signs in the heavens in those days, beginning in verse 24 of chapter 13 of Mark? After that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars of heaven will fall, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of earth to the farthest part of heaven. Now, here we're talking about what I call astronomical perturbations, or visible signs, catastrophic signs that take place in the heaven. Now, this raises a very significant question of literary style and form. For this reason, that in the Old Testament, it was not at all uncommon or unprecedented for the prophets of Israel to describe visitations of divine judgment upon the earth by using graphic imagery very similar to this imagery, indicating a catastrophic judgment brought by God upon a city or on a nation in which these events were described in terms of astronomical perturbations that did not take place literally, but were prophetic forms of metaphorical language. Let me give you some examples of those from my book. We read in Isaiah 13, chapter 9, or verse 9, verse 10, and verse 13, the following description of the judgment of God on the destruction of Babylon, or Tyre. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. Now pay attention to this portion. For the stars of heaven and the shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place. Now this language is almost identical to the language that Jesus uses in the Olivet Discourse with respect to his coming. Now there are other portions in the Old Testament where we see the same kind of language that was used by Old Testament prophecies to predict God's judgment on in events that had already taken place. Tyre was visited by divine wrath. Babylon has fallen, and those prophecies were already fulfilled without a literal fulfillment of these astronomical upheavals or catastrophes. Another passage is from Isaiah 34, verses 3 to 5. Here, Isaiah announces the desolation of Bozrah, which is the capital of Eden, and he does it in the following manner. He says, quote, "The mountains shall be melted with the blood of the slain, all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down as a leaf falleth from off the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven, behold, it shall come down upon Idumea." Now, this is the language employed by the prophecy of Isaiah of events that clearly did take place without a literal astronomical upheaval. So the point is this: when we come to the Olivet Discourse, as I will look at in our next session, the question is, the big issue with the Olivet Discourse is how we understand this word here, generation. This generation shall not pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. What it comes down to, in simple terms, is this to be interpreted literally or figuratively? Now, we've seen the astronomical perturbations. If they're interpreted literally, then the only way we can save the Olivet Discourse is to interpret this figuratively, and to look at the coming of Christ in a different way from how we're accustomed to seeing it on this occasion. In other words, in simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, something in this text has to be interpreted figuratively, and something has to be interpreted literally, or there's no way we can salvage this text from the guns of higher criticism. And so the question that remains for us to examine is, what do we look at literally, and what do we look at figuratively? And most critically, again, is the time frame reference of this generation. In our study of the crisis of eschatology in our day, we have placed great emphasis on the criticisms that have been launched against the Bible and against the credibility of Jesus with respect to unfulfilled prophecies that Jesus, as well as the apostles, made with respect to the coming of Christ. And the critics have argued that Jesus' predicted coming did not occur within the time frame that the New Testament gives for the fulfillment of that event. And as we've seen so far in our study, the critical phrase in the Olivet Discourse is the reference to this generation, where it is said, this generation will not pass away, I'll use the phrase pass away, until all these things are fulfilled. Now, an ordinary prima facie understanding of this text, as Bertrand Russell made it in his critique of Christianity, as well as the higher critics in biblical scholarship, say that this generation must refer, literally, to that group of people who were the contemporaries of Jesus, and a generation lasts approximately 40 years, and that the pass away refers to their demise. That is, that this group of people will not all die or pass away until everything in this prophecy comes to pass. The all these things is then thought to be all-inclusive. Now, we also see that the whole problem is exacerbated by our knowledge, as I've mentioned, that which precipitated the whole discourse, Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, did in fact take place within the time frame of 40 years, as these events unfolded in AD 70. So I think, again, we see and feel the weight of the problem. I labor this point for this reason. I'm not convinced that evangelical Christians really do feel the weight of this problem. And that's part of the problem of ignoring higher criticism and simply preaching to the choir and talking among ourselves and not really listening to this criticism that is raised. And we have to give an answer to these critics that have devastated Scripture and the person of Christ. And so I think it is our obligation as Christians who believe in the deity of Christ and in the inspiration of the Scriptures to feel the weight of this burden and to address it as we encounter it. Now, there are many scholars who feel that the escape hatch from all of this difficulty is found in verse 32 of Mark 13. Immediately following the time frame reference that Jesus gives, again in verse 30, he says, "Assuredly, most certainly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place." Again, let me remind you that the statement that Jesus makes here is made in emphatic terms. I can't conceive of Jesus being any more emphatic about the time frame than he is here when he says, "Assuredly, I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away until all of these things take place." And he goes on to amplify that by saying, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." So Jesus is hanging an awful lot of his own credibility on what he's saying here. These are my words, and my words will last longer than the heaven and the earth. So then we hear the escape hatch in verse 32. "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." Now that verse 32 is one of the most controversial verses in all of Mark's gospel, because among other things, it's a verse in which Jesus puts a limit on his own knowledge when he said that the day and the hour knows nobody, not even the angels, not even the Son, just the Father. And that's provoked all kinds of Christological debate, but obviously Jesus is referring here to his human nature, and the human nature is not omniscient. It would be heretical to assert that the human nature of Christ knew everything. The divine nature did, of course, but the human nature knows only what a normal, ordinary human being could know, or a human who is informed by the divine. I mean, there are times when there is knowledge communicated from the divine nature to the human nature. We're not separating them, but we are distinguishing them. But I don't want to get carried away on that. That's a Christological issue. But with respect to this problem that we're dealing with, many scholars come to verse 32 and they say, obviously Jesus here is qualifying his prediction by saying, after all, nobody really knows the day and the hour, including me. So, in a sense, Jesus has a get-out-of-jail-free card here for being wrong about stating that it would all take place within the time frame of this generation.
Sure.
And so, since he has this disclaimer that nullifies or reduces the import of his previous statement, that it would come in this generation. Well, I think this is where a text is problematic. Sometimes scholars use tortuous devices to try to solve the problem. There's no reason to see that verse 32 would nullify Jesus' broader statement earlier when he says simply, this generation will not pass away until all of these things take place. And then he qualifies it by saying what? I don't know what day in this generation. I don't know what hour it will be, but I do know this. It's going to be within the time frame of this generation. That sometime within this generation, before this generation passes away, all these things will come to pass. But don't ask me for the day and the hour. That would seem to be a much more sober understanding of what Jesus is saying here. And we don't want our Lord to put them on and take them off, as it were, to assert it's going to happen within a time frame with his left hand, and 5 minutes later, less than 5 minutes later, say it's not going to happen in that time frame. Once he's made the statement as emphatically as he had, that it will take place, most definitely, most assuredly, within the time frame of a generation, we have to live with that. And we have to say, okay, what does he mean by generation? What does he mean that this generation will not pass away? Again, the critics, including Bertrand Russell, understand the phrase this generation to refer to a group of people who were the contemporaries of Jesus, those people who were alive at that time, referring to an age group of human beings. So, when Jesus qualifies it, as it were, in verse 32, he is saying, I can't be any more specific than it'll be this generation, but keep this in mind, it does not mean that he's any less specific that it would be within the time frame of that generation. Now, again, this business of passing away, we're assuming that it refers to the death of those who are alive. Now, that is consistent with the other time frame reference that Bertrand Russell used to refute the New Testament and to refute Jesus, when Jesus said, some of you will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in power and so on. Now there, the passing away becomes taste death. So there's a consistency here that we're talking about, that some people are going to survive long enough to see certain events that Jesus predicted fulfilled. What else can he mean when he says some of you will not taste death? Now, again, in an effort to deal with that problem that's found in Matthew 16, we are told by certain scholars that that was fulfilled in either the transfiguration or the resurrection. Because in the transfiguration, people did see Jesus manifested in glory. Because on the Mount of Transfiguration, his divine nature shone through, and the disciples, Peter, James, and John, had that awe-inspiring encounter there with the transfigured Jesus where they beheld his glory. And so maybe what Jesus was referring to was either to the manifestation of his glory in the transfiguration or the manifestation of his glory in resurrection or ascension, not to his coming later. Now, there's a problem with that. And that is that the transfiguration, according to Matthew, took place 6 days after Jesus gave that time frame reference. And the resurrection, a couple of weeks, and so on. So it doesn't seem very reasonable to me for Jesus to say, some of you aren't going to die until this takes place, unless he was expecting the majority of his disciples to die in the following week. And when he was simply saying, some of you are going to survive long enough to see this come to pass. It just doesn't seem likely to me that our Lord would speak in terms of surviving death in an event that's going to take place in the next week or the next couple of weeks, unless, of course, they were faced with an impending battle where survival was not expected or something of that sort, which we obviously don't have at this point. So my point is this, that to apply that text of some of you will not taste death to the transfiguration or to these other events related to it in the short term, I think is too near a time. I think Jesus, when he says that some of you will not taste death, is obviously thinking longer term than 1 week or a month or so. Well, now another way, in fact the most common way, in which scholars try to answer the critics with respect to the unfulfilled prophecy of the New Testament and of Jesus, is by interpreting the word generation in a way that does not make it refer to that group of people who were alive at the time Jesus made the prophecy and who were the contemporaries of Christ. But rather, the term generation is used to describe a kind, type, or sort. A kind, a type, or a sort of person. That's like Jesus was saying, people like this will not pass away until all of these things come to pass. Now again, that's the most common. Now, some scholars say that the type of person that Jesus is describing here is the believer, or the righteous ones. That some of you who are faithful and believing and trusting in me will not pass away until all of these things will be fulfilled. In other words, there will be believers still around whenever I return at the end of the age. That's one of the interpretations. And of course, that interpretation gets everybody off the hook, because then generation doesn't refer to a 40-year period and restrict the fulfillment to the first century, and allows for the possibility of what Schweitzer called parousia, delay down through the centuries, that we can wait 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years for these things to take place. Now, more commonly, the generation that is described as a type or a sort of people refers not to the righteous or to believers, but to unbelievers, those who were of a wicked sort, a wicked generation. And Herman Ritterboss, whom I've already talked about, who gave us the already and not yet time frame approach to the kingdom of God teachings in the New Testament, Ritterboss takes the view that the Greek word here, ganeia, that is used to interpret or to be translated generation, is a description not of time frame, but of mind frame. That is, it's a mind frame reference saying people of this frame of mind will still be around until all of these things come to pass. Again, this ilk, this sort, this type of person will abide until all of these things are fulfilled. Now, again, That is the most common view that conservatives and evangelicals take to the Olivet Discourse to escape the guns of higher criticism. And I personally, frankly, find this less than exegetically satisfying. I do know that there are rare occasions in the Septuagint and in extra-biblical documents where that word Genea can be used to refer to sort or kind or type of person. But the usage of it in the New Testament overwhelmingly and consistently refers to a group of people who are alive at the particular time. And I want to take some time now to look at some of these passages. And the first passage we look at is in Matthew 23, verse 36. Now, in this context, Jesus is giving his final address that he gives presumably on the very same day that he gives the Olivet Discourse. And he said, quote, "All of these things shall come upon this generation." Now, to my understanding, I'm not aware of any commentator or any Matthean scholar who's ever interpreted that reference to anything other than those contemporaries that were alive at the time when Jesus talks about the things that will befall that generation. In Matthew 11, he says, "Whereunto shall I liken this generation?" Again, the commentators all agree that that referred to the existing generation of Jewish people. In Matthew 12, 39, 41, 42, and 45, listen to what we read. "The men of Nineveh shall rise up in judgment with this generation." Obviously, the men of Nineveh were an earlier generation. "The queen of the south shall rise up in the judgment with this generation. Even so shall it be also unto this wicked generation." And this can only refer to the then current existing generation of people that Jesus was warning. Again, Luke 11, verses 50 and 51. "That the blood of all the prophets may be required of this generation." Again, it shall be required of this generation. Mark 8:38. "Whoever shall be ashamed of me in this adulterous and sinful generation." And Luke 17:25. "The Son of Man must be rejected of this generation." The biblical context in which our Lord makes these statements, he's clearly talking about the decisive point in redemptive history where God has visited the nation of Israel in the person of his only begotten Son. And it was that generation that was alive at that time that had on the one hand the unspeakable privilege of seeing the Messiah come in the flesh. And yet at the same time, it was that generation who were convicted of the greatest guilt in Jewish history, because that was that generation that rejected the one who had come to their own, and they received him not. And so Jesus again and again in the New Testament warns that existing generation about the severity of judgment that will be on their heads, because their judgment will be far greater than those earlier generations in antiquity, such as were seen in the days of the Queen of Sheba and other periods, because the decisive crisis point has been reached with the coming of the Messiah. And he talks about the judgment that will come upon this generation. And the plain sense of those warnings refers to the judgment that will befall that last, final generation of apostate Israel at that time. In fact, apart from the use of this word genea, generation, we find in the Olivet Discourse, there are 38 other references to this word in the New Testament, and every one of them refers to a contemporary group of people that were then alive. Now, it's possible linguistically that genea could mean sort or type, or as Ritterboss suggests, a mind frame rather than a time frame. But what I'm saying to you is that the exegetical and linguistic evidence against that is overwhelming. And one would have to have a compelling reason to interpret the phrase, "This generation shall not pass away," until I'll interpret genea in a way other than the ordinary sense in which it is used in the New Testament. But what if the end of the age has come? What if what Jesus is talking about here is not the end of history, but the end of the Jewish age? What if Jesus is talking about not his final consummate coming to fulfill all prophecy about the final renovation of heaven and earth, but what he's talking about is his coming of judgment on Israel, which is manifested in the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem? What if that's the focal point of his warning on the Mount of Olives? I believe it is. I'm not positive, but I do believe that that's what he was talking about there. And in our next session, we'll look further at the reasons for that. As we continue now with our study of the crisis in eschatology, the point I want to look at in this session is this question. When Jesus spoke about his coming at the end of the age, did he mean by that phrase, the end of the age, the end of world history? Or was he talking more specifically about the end of the Jewish age? That's one of the critical points that are in dispute here with respect to the time frame references of New Testament eschatology. I'd like to read a portion of the text of Matthew for you from the New King James Bible, or the New King James translation, where we read in chapter 13, verse 38, Jesus' interpretation of the parable of the tares. He says, and I quote, "The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age." Now, the reason I read from the New King James is that it reads differently from the original King James. Now, if you'll follow with me for a moment, I'll read from the original King James. In verse 38, we read, "The field is the world." That's exactly the way the New King James renders it. "The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels." Verse 40, "Therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world." Well, notice in verse 38, 39, and 40, 3 times the Old King James Version translated the words of Jesus by using the English word world. In the New King James, World is used in verse 38, but in verses 39 and 40, the word age is used instead of world. Now, why is that? Why the change? Well, the simple reason for the change is that there are two different Greek words in the New Testament text that are being translated here. In verse 38, the Greek word is the word cosmos, which is the common word used to describe the world. We talk about cosmic events and so on. That's the Greek word cosmos. Then in verses 39 and 40, we have the Greek word aion, which means age or epoch, not world. Now, I can only guess as to why the original translators of the King James Version translated the Greek word aion by the word world rather than age. My guess is that they assumed, as many have assumed, that when Jesus was talking about the end of the age, he meant the end of the human age, the end of world history. And so translators indicated that in the rendering of the text. And frankly, they shouldn't have done that because of the difference in the Greek words, and the New King James has corrected that somewhat loose translation of the original. But that still doesn't solve our problem, because the term end of the age could refer, of course, to the end of the human age. It refers to the end of some time period, the end of some epoch. Now, again, the question is whether it's the end of history as we know it, or is it more particular and definitive with reference to the Jewish age? Well, again, we have to ask the question, to assume the possibility of a distinction between the Jewish age and the human age, we could be open to the charge of just being engaged in unbridled speculation and creating out of thin air a distinction that the Bible is ignorant of. Now, in order for that not to be the case, I think it would be important for us to find in Scripture some reference to the use of this term age that is more particular and more distinctive than to the general concept of the age of human beings or of world history. Now, when we look at Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, which is found in the 21st chapter of his gospel, and I'll turn your attention to that now, we have some details in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse that are not found in either Matthew's version, in Matthew 24, or in Mark's version, in Mark 13. And the passage that is most interesting for us in this context, I will read to you, beginning at Luke chapter 21, verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart. And let not those who are in the country enter her. Now remember, I mentioned that early on in this series, that this was contrary advice to what was the universally accepted plan of survival in the case of a military assault or a siege. The people would immediately go to the strongest fortified city for their safety and security. And one of the reasons why Josephus tells us that 1.1 million people were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem is that because after the armies of Rome invaded and crossed the borders of Palestine, and the word was passed on through the villages and towns, people from all over fled to Jerusalem for safety. The Christians didn't, because Jesus here clearly gives the warning not to do that. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart. Let not those who are in the country enter her, for these are the days of vengeance. Whose vengeance? The vengeance of God is being poured out now upon Jerusalem. These are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. Again, this is one of the most remarkable future predictions that we find in any surviving literature of any type, from any place, at any time. One person said, give me one argument for the truth of Christianity. And the answer was the Jews. That the Jewish people have maintained their identity, their ethnic origins, without a homeland for 2,000 years. And they gather on a regular occasion and will say to each other, next year in Jerusalem. I'm of Irish descent. When I was a kid, my parents let me stay home from school on St. Patrick's Day because the popular radio, featured Irish songs all day. My mother sang Irish lullabies to me when I was an infant, when I would go to bed at night, and I grew up memorizing all these things. But as much as they tried to preserve our Irish heritage for 2 or 3 generations, we didn't meet around a table saying next year in Dublin. I'm an American. I don't really think of myself as being Irish anymore. But the Jews, despite the loss of their country and their center of worship, were dispersed throughout the whole world and never lost their identity. That is unheard of in world history. But it was predicted, that is, the dispersion of the Jews, is predicted by Jesus right here when he said, they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. Now here is the critical verse. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now here, Jesus doesn't talk about the Jewish age or the Gentile age. He doesn't use that language. But he speaks about this strange phrase, the times of the Gentiles. Now, simple, elementary deduction. What times of the Gentiles would be distinguished from what other times? Obviously, the Gentiles here is a word, the term Gentiles is a word that is used to differentiate Gentiles from Jews. And if there are times of the Gentiles, there are presumably the former, times of the Jews. And so we have a specific interim period in history that is called the times of the Gentiles. Now, I said earlier that there are those who are called fool preterists who believe that not only the elements of the Olivet Discourse were fulfilled in the first century, but all of the New Testament prophecies with respect to the future have already taken place, including the final coming of Christ, the great resurrection, the rapture, and all the rest. I don't believe that. But those people who take the position that everything has already been fulfilled in the first century have a problem with this phrase of the times of the Gentiles. And so they include it as a tiny little interim right before the destruction of Jerusalem, say between 69 and 70 A.D., where the Gentiles had a little thing going on in Jerusalem at the time that Josephus tells us about, but I'll skip over that now. When Luke talks about Jerusalem's being trodden underfoot by the Gentiles until, the word there that is translated until refers clearly to a terminal point. And that terminal point is the fulfillment of the times of the Gentile. That is to say, Jerusalem will be controlled by Gentiles for a definite period of history, but there will come a time when that will end. And that ending will coincide with the ending of the times of the Gentile. I'm making myself clear here. That there is a period in history beginning in 70 A.D., where Jerusalem is destroyed, the Jews are dispersed, and this following time is the times of the Gentile. But that doesn't go on forever. There is a time when that will be fulfilled. And presumably, the fulfillment will be related to the end of the trampling of Jerusalem underfoot by the Gentiles. Now, just as a matter of parenthesis at this point, let me remind you that what transpired in 1948 with the recreation of the Jewish state of Israel, after almost 2,000 years, and perhaps even more significantly, the recovery of the city of Jerusalem from the control of the Gentiles in 1967 with the 7-Day War, or the 6-Day War, how many days it was. In any case, those two events have triggered perhaps more eschatological speculation than any two events in the last 500 years. Because of people who are looking for the restoration of the nation of Israel as a supreme sign of the end time. Now, that relates to what kind of position you have in the millennium, and I'll go into that later. But I can remember in 1967 watching the Jewish soldiers fighting their way into the center of Jerusalem with their machine guns. And when they got to the Wailing Wall, they threw their guns down, forgot about the firefight, went right over to the Wailing Wall and started praying and carrying on. And I remember going to an Old Testament scholar that night and saying, well, what do you do with this? He says, well, I don't know what to do with this. He says, but this is interesting. That's when Karl Barth said people started reading the Bible in one hand and their newspapers in the other hand. Now, but this is an obscure passage here, and it's the only time in all of the discourse of the three synoptic Gospels that any mention is made about the times of the Gentile. But we do have another reference to the times of the Gentiles. It's found not in the Olivet Discourse, but in one of the most important didactic chapters with respect to future expectation in the writings of Paul, in Romans chapter 11, where Paul talks about the church being grafted into the original tree or the stump of Israel, and that we who are Gentiles or the Johnny-come-latelys, we have been ingrafted into the historic people of God who were, of course, the nation Israel. And Paul says in verse 25, Romans 11, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." Now again, there's a lot of controversy in interpreting Romans 11. Some believe that Paul here, when he speaks of Israel, is not describing ethnic Israel. He's not talking about Jewish people. He's talking about the new Israel, the Christian church. Now, I don't hold the view that God has two views and two plans of redemption, one for Israel and one for the church. I don't believe that for a minute. And I do believe that the church in the New Testament is the fulfillment of the covenant people of God known as Israel in the Old Testament. And so I don't divide those two. However, that does not mean that all ethnic distinctions are eliminated. And that Paul here, I believe, in Romans 11, when he just talks about Israel and in the same breath talks about Gentiles, he can only be distinguishing on the basis of ethnicity. I believe that the apostle is saying here in chapter 11 that God is not done with Jewish people. That there's still another chapter of history that we await, where God will once again deal with his people, ethnic origin of Israel. Again, he says, let me read it again. Blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, that is, the Jews. But concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So I hear Paul in Romans 11 talking about future redemptive action with respect to his covenant people, the Jews. Now, in any case, the most important point here is that for the second time, we see this phrase in the New Testament, the times of the Gentiles. And if there's any doubt about what it is distinguished from in Luke, there is no doubt about it in Romans. That the times of the Gentiles is a time frame that is distinguished from the times of the Jewish people. And he talks, even as Luke does, of the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled. Now, somebody might want to ask me, well, if that's the case, and if Luke is saying that Jerusalem will be trodden underfoot until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled, and it's no longer trodden underfoot, doesn't that mean that the times of the Gentiles are over? And we should be at the end? Well, not necessarily, because for one thing, though the Jews conquered Jerusalem, they still have much of it that is in the control of Gentiles, and the Jews don't have complete domination over the city of Jerusalem. They're sharing it, still in a certain sense being underfoot of Gentiles. So I don't know what that means, whether the Jews will be expelled from Jerusalem tomorrow and we wait another 3,000 years before the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. I doubt that. It certainly does give one reason to pause and say, are we on the brink of some great, significant, redemptive, historical event? Now, again, the temptation in every generation is to think that, because we all desperately want to see the final consummation of the kingdom of Christ. And every generation should be diligent and vigilant and have that hope burning in their breast. But for now, I'm just trying to say that if the age of the Gentiles begins when we know that the times of the Gentiles begin in 70 AD, if that's the case, would it not follow logically that the times of the Jews or the Jewish age ended in 70 AD? So the end of the Jewish age, the beginning of the Gentile epoch, if you will. So that, again, the time frame fits year 70 rather than being opposed to it. Now, quickly, before our time is up, I want to give some references of other time frame references that are not by any means exhaustive, but that refer to the nearness, expectancy of the last days according to the writers of the Scriptures. In Matthew 10:12, will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Matthew 26, Jesus was speaking to the high priest. He said, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Paul's letter to the Romans for chapter 13, now it is high time to wake out of sleep. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. 1 Corinthians 7, the form of this world is passing away. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, critical passage. The ends of the ages have come upon us. Philippians 4:5, the Lord is at hand. In the general epistles, James 5:8-9, the coming of the Lord is at hand. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. 1 Peter 4:7, the end of all things is at hand. 1 John 2:18, it's the last hour. We know that it is the last hour, and in the book of Revelation, which we'll look at separately, chapter 1, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ with respect to things which must shortly take place. 1:3, the time is near. 3:11, behold, I come quickly. Chapter 22, verses 6 and 7, God's angel shows his servants the things which must shortly take place. Behold, I am coming quickly, and so on. We have a list of reference after reference after reference in the New Testament that calls to the critical situation that the world was in the first century with respect to the day of the Lord, which was the day of vengeance, of God's visitation of wrath that was tied to some kind of coming of Jesus. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is that that coming is not the final coming of Jesus, but it is his judgment coming on Israel. The judgment coming of Christ on Israel. And in our next session, I want to look at some fascinating things that are recorded by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in which he gives us an eyewitness account of the siege and of the destruction of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem. I think that one of the most fascinating chapters in all of church history is, of course, the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem. And we don't have a biblical record of that very, very important moment that took place in 70 AD. But what we do have is a fascinating blow-by-blow eyewitness account of the siege of Jerusalem and all of the things that transpired in its destruction, written for us by the famous Jewish historian Josephus. Now, one of the things that surprises me is how few Christians have ever taken the time to read the history of these events that was compiled by Josephus. And every person that I've known who has taken the time to read his Jewish wars has remarked that they were absolutely enwrapped by the reading of this history because it was so fascinating. So what I want to do in our session today is look briefly at some of the main points of the report that comes down to us from history, from the pen of Flavius Josephus. Josephus was born in 37 AD during the reign of the Emperor Caligula. And we don't know the exact year of his death, but we know it was after the year 100. We also know that Josephus was born into a priestly family of the Jews, but when he grew up, he became not a priest, but a member of the party of the Pharisees. And he distinguished himself in his earlier years as a governor, territorial governor of Galilee. He also was known as a military strategist and was served as a general in the Jewish army. We know, of course, that he also was a historian, and he functioned during the siege of Jerusalem as a go-between between the Roman armies and the officials that were holding out in Jerusalem, and how that came to pass we'll look at in just a moment. But in the 19th century, The historical reliability of Josephus came under strong attack by critical scholars of the liberal school. Traditionally, Josephus has been one of the most respected historians of antiquity, but the 19th century critics accused him of exaggeration of details and of being engaged in a kind of self-aggrandizement in his own writings, in which he was said to be tooting his own horn. However, part of that is related to the general spirit of criticism towards ancient writers, and though we're not sure of the exact detailed accuracy of all things that Josephus reports to us, at least we have the benefit of an eyewitness who was a well-known writer of his day and who was in a unique position to report on both sides of the conflict. And so the writings that he has provided for us are extreme importance to try to understand the significance of what took place in the year 70. Now, Josephus was very conversant with the writings of the Old Testament prophets, and he himself saw the destruction of Jerusalem in terms of fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. In fact, there are some of the aspects of Josephus' own writings where one might say that he fancied himself something of a prophet. But if one were not even interested in the religious significance of what happened in Jerusalem in those days, just to get an insight into Roman military strength, weaponry, tactics, and strategy, the writings of Josephus are a treasury in that regard. He gives these detailed descriptions, for example, of the battering ram and how it was used, the catapult, and other forms of weaponry that the Romans perfected in the ancient world and used to be quite successful in their military conquest. Now, the destruction of Jerusalem did not happen overnight. It began earlier with the invasion of Palestine by the Romans in the late 60s under the leadership of one of their greatest generals, whose name was Vespasian. Now, in the year 68 was the year in which the Emperor Nero died, and upon the death of Nero, there was a tremendous period of internal conflict, indeed civil war, that went on in Rome, and there was a rapid succession of emperors to ascend to the throne after the death of Nero. Immediately succeeding Nero was a man by the name of Galba, who only lasted a few months until he was murdered, and then Galba was replaced by Otho, and again Otho lasted just a short time. In the year 69 he was murdered, and then he was the general to come home from his invasion of Palestine in order to become the emperor. And so Vespasian did. He left the battlefield, went back, and was acclaimed the emperor of Rome, and he brought some stability now, once again, to the Roman Empire, and he reigned as emperor from the year 69 to the year 79, after which he was succeeded by his son Titus. Now, when he left the battlefield after the initial stages of the invasion of Palestine and was recalled to Rome, Vespasian then turned the authority
big is coming. Quick, find the bushes. Why would there be a deep crow here? They only leave their nests to exact terrible vengeance on those who have wronged them. I wonder who that is. That deep crow is crazy powerful. Don't even try to fight it. We're gonna need a distraction. Hey, I have an idea. You can bait it with food. I don't know what they eat. Just a whole bunch of hair and skin and stuff.
Some tea.
Milk.
Okay.
I'm gonna be waiting outside.
Well, you know where it's at. Get it?
Talk about.
Well, you know how to do that too.
Well, I want to go as quick as you can to the bowl.
What?
Well, I don't want to swallow it.
You don't want to spill it. Don't spill it then.
No, I don't want to swallow it.
You don't want to stir it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, put the milk in the glass and put the chocolate in there and bring me something the cup and I'll stir it for you, I guess. I can stir it probably quicker, right?
Ah, sweet. Batiri tea. Can you save some for me? It's for, thing. It will probably need some roughage. Try finding a carnivorous coughing plant. Be careful. Now we just put out our bait bundle and wait for the miracle of nature to unfold before us.
Jaza could help. Jaza's of choice. Jaza could help.
Are you friends with Jaza? Do you work for them or something? They come up a... Let's see if this keeps the deep crow busy. And that's the circle of life, everybody.
You did that
It's
all.
just beautiful.
Stop it.
Bring it to me.
What do I have to bring to you?
Did you put everything away beside, like, the milk and the chocolate?
Use Jaza's devil key from the airship.
Wait.
Okay.
No.
Well, you can
Wait.
leave the chocolate out for a
Bring
few,
Jaza?
but bring me the glass.
I'm gonna.
Oh my gosh, what's wrong with you?
Can I put this into this?
I thought you already put it in.
No, I can too. So.
Sure. Yeah. Put it in just a small glass?
Yeah.
Let go. I'm changing directions. 3 or 4 change.
So then it speeds it up, basically.
I'm just mixing it up. That's how I'm doing it.
Okay.
Be careful, don't spill it. Hold it. No, don't drink it while you're walking. You can stand there and drink it, but don't walk with it. You'll end up spilling it or hurting yourself. That straw can hurt you. Take it out of your mouth while you're walking. Listen to me. Even if you're not around me, you should still listen. Pay attention.
There's nowhere to hide. You'll have to fight.
Walnut says you got him? The gems? I'm making you a portal to get out. And don't ask why I didn't just make you a portal to get in there. It's some real crazy wizard stuff, and you would not get it.
Why did you save me? Yes, I know Taza. He opened my eyes. I was going to leave this place with him. I'm free. I think Jaza's in a lot of trouble. I wouldn't go after him. He's made a lot of enemies. I'm finally saved! If you're looking for Jaza, bring a shovel. Last I saw, they were lowering him into a hole in the ground. And not a nice one either.
ship of Captain Red Fox's here. We must fire it, but Jazza can find no ammunition.
Well, tell Jazza ballista bolts don't grow on trees, okay?
Jazza bolts are made of wood. Wood with a metal tooth.
Whoever you are, listen. Grab anything that isn't nailed to this deck and shoot it back.
Thought I already stopped streaming.
Go ahead and kick this. And keep going after it. It makes it very easy to know if you have head on if you just pop in the locker like that.
Jazza sees a boat. Fire it back. They have dragon fire. Shoot it. Ah, missed.
Go ahead and hit. You don't have a big over by him. It's kind of sucks. I'm actually going to place. You can actually make force go maybe turn and not go for a roll. If you just pretend to activate your ability. So I'm going to place this right here. And we have back here. Yeah, go back here. Go ahead. Hit this. Him. Make your choice activated. You want this guy.
Another boat stayed intact. You winged it.
He's going out towards unsafe areas, so I'm not going to go after the other guy. He's going in the building. Makes it a lot harder for me. So go ahead. I'm going to hit him. I'm going to put a paddle or put a portal down right here. Let's see what that does. Healing up really fast. Means that you're wasting time. You're wasting time healing. I don't know why you ran right at me. Let's go back to this guy.
Jazza sees another boat.
He really wants that head on. I'm not gonna let you get that head on, sorry, buddy. Let's go over to this gen. Right there on my right. Wasting time healing, that's what I mean. So if they do decide to do it, they'll actually have a lot, I have a lot of pressure on them. Go back to this one.
Jazza,
Try to break
I
it.
knew you'd come back. I love you. I'm gonna tell the world. I don't know how it's gonna work exactly. If you lay eggs or... Oh, it doesn't matter. We're gonna figure this out.
Jazza is only here for Jazza's key.
Down.
That hurts, Jazza. You always know just how to
I
hurt.
forgot you can't jump off and just do that.
Welcome to Act It Turns. You're getting